Talk about global economy and how it affects the American economy and how the American economy affects the global economy. It is interrelationship. Okay, um, let's look at globalization. Okay, globalization is the process which businesses and other organizations develop and influence international influence in how they start basically buying and trading, selling manufactured goods around the world. Um, the question here is this a good thing or a bad thing? Um, Back in early 17th century, China decided to close itself to the world. This is what's referred to as a closed market. And they closed themselves off from trade throughout the rest of the world. Now, the British and the Portuguese were able to force China to sell to them, but only in an extremely limited fashion. Because of this, China did not develop along with the rest of the world. After a couple hundred years, China was still virtually 1700. It was the 1900s, but yet most Chinese people were still living like they were back in 1700. Another good example of this is Japan. Japan closed its doors in the 1400s when the Portuguese first arrived and started trying to spread Christianity into Japan. And then when the Spanish actually spread Christianity and then used Christianity as a way to take over the Philippine Islands, it scared the crap out of the Japanese, and the Japanese closed their entire country to Western influence. They went so far as to actually round up all those who had had contact with Europeans and force them to convert back to their native religions and killed anybody who refused, destroyed the churches, and either drove off or executed all Europeans within inside of Japan. And then they strictly closed Japan to trade to any outside influence. And because of that, by the time of the 1800s, the 1840s, when the United States eventually sails into the harbor at Tokyo with our modern Navy, we found that the Japanese were still basically functioning with matchlocks that were guns that were introduced to them by the Spanish and the Portuguese back in the 1400s, and that their primary weapons were still the bow and arrow and the Japanese sword. Why do I bring these up? Well, because if they had traded with the rest of the world, they would have taken in benefits such as modernization, new techniques and influences, and it would have changed their society and their way of life, and they probably would not have been as vulnerable. Anytime you have a closed system, uh, that actually limits in the long term the growth of its country. So globalization is super, super duper important. It helps bring about new technology and new advances. That's the good thing. The bad thing about globalization is that as we trade with the rest of the world, we often make ourselves vulnerable to the influences of what's happening in their country making an impact into ours. Good example of this was during the early 1970s. The Middle East was going through some serious growing pains. You had Israel being attacked by Egypt and Jordan. There was some fighting going on, and a new development where Middle Eastern countries decided to reject Western style civilization and the development of OPEC. They basically closed down oil trade with Western countries, and they caused an actual crisis in the United States, the oil and gas crisis of the 1970s. Why? Because we had become dependent upon oil from the Middle East, and they were changing the um, way or the rules or the trade agreement between us and them, and it made a huge impact in vehicles. Case in point, in the 1950s and 1960s and early 70s, car manufacturers in America made muscle cars, cars with big giant engines in them. Why? Because gas prices were cheap. However, the oil crisis in the late 1970s caused for America to recognize that we needed to have more fuel economy vehicles. So out with the V8 engines and in with the 4 cylinders and the Asian market vehicles, also emission controls and other things in order to cause people to buy vehicles with less horsepower, better fuel economy, and less reliance upon oil and gas from other countries. So you basically had the end of the muscle car movement of the 1960s and 1970s, all because some Middle Eastern guys decided to cut off the oil tap. That basically ended, the Mustangs and the Camaros and the Barracudas and other fancy muscle cars of the 60s and 70s came to a grinding halt, and then entered in cars of the 1980s with better fuel economy, but with much less horsepower and much less, an entire market of hot rods were completely gone at that point, just because of what happened in the Middle East. What are good things and bad things about trade with other nations? Why do we trade with nations? Why do we want nations to trade with us? First and foremost, money. If you do not trade with other countries, then you are in a closed loop, basically handing your money to another person who then hands that money back to another person, and eventually it just makes a big giant loop back around to you. By trade, you actually make money from other countries, aka you are increasing your net earnings potential and your ability to make money. So trading with other countries is the #1 way for a nation to grow financially. And once again, money is why we do it. We don't want to be poor. Also, it is opportunity for advancement. And last but not least, money. You want to know what makes the world go around? Well, money. That's what makes the world go around. Our trade with other countries ensure that we will continue to be able to make money. Why do the nations want to trade with us? Well, I bet you can't guess what it is. Resources, ideas, food, and supplies. That's right, they want our stuff. The United States is extremely fortunate that we are geographically huge with lots of landmass, and this allows for us to have a abundance of resources that most countries in the world can only dream of. Also, the size of our country allows for us to be able to produce things like food. We are one of the highest grain suppliers to the world. We produce more wheat and rice and soybean than any other country in the world. And we sell those products to every country in the world. Case in point, the embargo that we have been having with China for the last year and a half has drastically diminished this embargo. This is where we're not trading. We are refusing to trade for certain goods with China in hopes of making them trade more fairly with us. They have decided to stop buying our food. This has affected our economy greatly, as soybean farmers have lost billions of dollars in the soybean market because their #1 buyer was China, and China is no longer buying our soybean. They are buying soybean from other countries around the world. This is allowing those countries to benefit from that market while the United States is hurting from that market. Eventually, China and the U.S. will eventually get over these embargoes and trade war between us, and we will go back to a more normal trade, and the soybean farmer will once again be making more money. However, until that happens, soybean farmers in America have been losing money for the last 2 years, with hopes of better deals in the future. Also, our supplies. surplus that we have of things that we don't need. We produce more food than we need. Most countries in the world cannot produce enough food. They must import food. Because of that, they need a place to buy it. We, on the other hand, import goods that we want. Textiles from around the world, furniture goods, and other odds and ends we import from all over the world in exchange for the resources that we have. There has been an anti-globalization movement, basically free market capitalism. The opposition to the free market or corporate globalization, they claim that by globalizing the world and trading around the world, that the United States, because of our need to take over or to buy goods from around the world, this is actually causing some problems in other countries. In particular, China is dealing with environmental issues. To feed the Americans' need for products, China is producing products at a rapid rate, but to be able to do it cheaply enough and fast enough in order to make money, they have cut much of the safety regulations and pollution regulations. If you lived in Beijing, China, about 300 days out of the year, you have to wear a mask when you go outside because the pollution from the factories is so bad that it's actually toxic for you to breathe the air without some form of filter. The particles floating in the air cause breathing and respiratory problems. Whereas in Indonesia, where textile mills have moved their production of clothing to Indonesia, Bangladesh, India, and other places where labor is cheap, there has been a lot of civil rights or personal rights, human rights violations happening in these countries as sweatshops around the world have set up in order to fuel America's need for what we call throwaway textiles. This is where you buy a shirt, you wear it 3 or 4 times, and then you eventually send it to Goodwill, or you just chuck it because it doesn't last very long. Years ago, when textile industries were starting to move out of the United States in the 1990s, there was a huge movement to buy made in America. You could buy a t-shirt in America for $10, $12 a shirt. That shirt would last for years. You could wear it every day. It would slowly grow old and fade, and but the shirt itself was made of good quality, so it lasted for more than a short period of time. Walmart even went as far as putting little stickers of American flags on products made here in America. As well, they also put products made in China next to them. Now, they were made with much, much cheaper quality materials, much thinner cloth. The sewing and stuff was not as perfect, but the product was half the price, virtually about $5 a shirt. In which, by the way, that price is pretty much stable. It's been $5 a shirt for the last 25 years for a t-shirt. At Walmart, and what they discovered at Walmart and other outlets, stores, is that Americans would rather save $1, buy the cheaper made product, even though it only lasted for a short time, 6 months to a year. If you've ever bought a Walmart t-shirt, you know that most of those t-shirts are only good for about a year before they develop pinholes in them, the neck stretches out, rips form, or the color of the shirt fades to the point that you no longer wish to wear it. But that most Americans buy these cheaply made shirts and would rather own a cheaply made shirt for a year for half the price than to buy an American made shirt that lasted for multiple years at twice the price, because we wanted the cheaper item at that time. This is one of the reasons why we don't make t-shirts in America really anymore. Most of our t-shirts are made in Bangladesh or in the Philippines or someplace like that, instead of being made here in the United States. But many of these people who are making these products, in order to be able to make that product cheaply and to be able to make it in the vast quantities that we need in the United States, a lot of human rights violations happen, such as sweatshops. So most of the clothing that you are wearing right now was probably made in a sweatshop. This is where people are working for insanely low wages. They can't even really make a living, but they work hard day and night, 7 days a week, 365 days a year in order for you to be able to own a cheap t-shirt. Or you may even have children making the clothing, working basically as slave labor in some countries. So this is a major problem for America as we allow for globalization. We are allowing for this free market, but at the same time, it may be free for us to have all these products and free for us to be able to make lots of money doing it. But without the regulations of the United States that most countries do not have, there's a lot of abuse that is happening environmentally, human rights wise, even to the point of slave labor. So that's something to think about. Trade deficit. The United States functions at a trade deficit. We import a lot more products than we export. Now, that does not mean that we do not export products. We do. But most of our exports are in intellectual property, aka we come up with the design or the mental business end of it, and we thus sell those designs to the factories around the world that produce the products. We don't really produce much of the physical products in the United States anymore. However, we are a huge intellectual exporter. In other words, we're the ones that come up with the bright ideas of how to make all the products that people want to have. One of the biggest things that we actually export to the world is education. If you are living in the Middle East, and let's say your daddy is a sheik, and you want to go to college, more than likely there's a few countries in the world in which you may attend college. You could attend college in the Middle East, but more than likely you're going to come to the United States, England, or France, or Germany to get your education, depending on what country your country is most friendly with. The United States educates most of the leaders of the world. When you see a king or a president in another country and they have a formal education, there is a very strong chance that that formal education came from the United States. Anytime you go to visit a university, the thousands of foreign students who are taking advantage of the American college education system is incredible. And they spend millions and billions of dollars every year in tuition and other expenses to live and go to school here in the United States. So kind of interesting. Trade surplus. This is when your country exports exceeds the cost of your imports. You may not physically sell as many products, but the value of those products exceed what you are importing. For example, China imports. We import more things from China, but China is importing what they have is a profit surplus. For China, the United States is really important. We are their number one market. So yes, they do import from the United States, and they import stuff that they can't get in China from the United States. However, if the United States stops importing from China, we impact their economy more than they impact ours, because most of what we buy from China is unnecessary. It's want goods, not need goods. Trade organizations. In order to make sure that there is fair trade around the world, there are several trade organizations in which devote themselves to fair trade practices and also free and open market practices so that the world economies stay in balance. The International Trade Organization is one, the ITO. The World Trade Organization, the WTO, sets up global deals from around the world. Now, the WTO is one of these ones that we got involved with in the 1990s. For the most part, it's been a pretty successful relationship. However, because we're trading around the world and we have removed a lot of barriers between us and them, this has allowed for a lot of jobs in America to go to third world countries. However, the WTO monitors and looks for human rights violations and some of the environmental violations. That, however, is not always effective. You can only ask a country to clean up their act. You can't force them to clean up their act. The World Bank, over 189 members, including the United States, and it's also the bank that provides loans to other countries as part of the UN, the United Nations. It is in partnership, and it's trying to end poverty in countries, and they lend money to countries that are trying to develop. The idea here is that if developing countries are able to get themselves out of the third world status, then they will be able to buy goods from other countries instead of just exporting. So a country like Ghana or Kenya in Africa borrowing money as a owner of a business in one of those countries, you're increasing the standard of living of your employees and the community where your factory is, but you are also making it possible for those people to buy goods from other countries. So it's a good idea for the United States to help those countries become more profitable so that they can buy goods from our country. If you look at where you're buying your goods from, you want to be able to buy the best. And honestly, the United States sells a lot of the best stuff in the world. So as those countries do better, we will do better. The European Union, it has 43 members in the European Union. However, England has exited and is currently exiting from the European Union. They voted to leave. Why? Well, there has been problems in recent years with the European Union. The idea was in the 1990s that Europe would go into the European Union, where all the countries in Europe would join together and they would have a common currency, so that when you went to England or to France, when you were trading with your neighbors, there would be a common currency in which you could trade with, and that together you would be able to trade more freely. Also, when you consider the size of countries in Europe, you're going to have to trade with your neighbors and driving across borders and things like that. Being a part of the UN, you had open borders between one country to the next. So if you were a baker in London and you wanted to carry your goods to France and to Spain, you got in your truck, you went across the channel via the tunnel. That's an underwater tunnel that goes all the way from England to the mainland in France. Enter into France. You didn't have to even stop at the border, you just drove. No passport necessary. And you obeyed the driving rules and laws in France, and then once you dropped off in France, you headed for Spain, and then at the end of the day, you turned around and headed back to England. All in one day, you made a round trip from France to Spain and back again. This made it very easy for owners of businesses to do trade with other countries throughout Europe. However, some countries did not do what they needed to do properly. In particular, Italy and Greece and Spain have had problems with their part of their own economy. And because of this, the other nations of the European Union, particularly Germany, has had to bail these countries out because their countries needed economic reform in order to continue to be profitable. The most profitable countries in the European Union would have to be England, France, and Germany. The rest are either somewhat stable, or in the case of Italy, Greece, and Spain, they actually basically filed bankruptcy. Because of this, England has decided to go it alone, leave the European Union in order to protect itself financially. It doesn't want to have to carry the bad debt of smaller European countries who can't manage their money. We'll see how the European Union continues to hold itself together. Right now, Germany's kind of the force that's holding all of the European Union together. So there you are. But the European Union trades with the rest of the world, and the European Union negotiates for all the countries that are a part of it. So when they negotiate trade with Russia or with China or even the United States, they do it as a group, which gives them more power to negotiate better deals. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, this is OPEC. When I talked about countries in the Middle East that messed with the oil during the 1970s in America, I was talking about this little group, OPEC. This is Middle Eastern countries, 13 nations in all, that unify together in order to basically monkey with the prices of oil from the Middle East. And anytime that they need to put pressure on the United States or other countries who are oil dependent, in other words, we need oil from other places, they use their ability to trade or basically cut the tap off, turn the oil supply off, in order to get their way to negotiate trade deals and other things with those Middle Eastern countries. OPEC has been a pain in our backside since the 1970s. The North Atlantic Trade Organization, or what is referred to as NATO, it is 28 members in group. This also has the purpose of safeguarding freedoms and securities for its members, politically and militarily. The United States is a part of NATO. Matter of fact, we are the #1 major part of NATO. I think that A should stand for America. This is where we get involved with each other in support for each other, security-wise, in order to defend the members of this group from bad practices and even military actions from outside countries. NATO was a huge factor in the 1970s and the 1960s and 80s to fighting what was considered the Cold War between NATO and Russia. The 28 members of NATO formed treaties with one another in order to protect ourselves from Russian invasion and the Russian threat. So it's not as powerful as it used to be, but we're still a part of it. The North American Free Trade Act, NAFTA. This is my nemesis, my most hated thing. This is actually why I'm a school teacher today, is because NAFTA was signed in the 1990s by Bill Clinton, and what it did is it opened up free trade between Canada and Mexico. The reason why I personally hate this one is because that Free Trade Act caused many of the jobs in which I made a living from. I used to make furniture factories and textile mills and sawmills and other things like that that were here locally in the area, and I used to build the factories. Those factories, however, have long since closed, and many of them moved to Mexico or Canada because the employees in those countries are paid so much less than what people here in America were needing to be paid. And without the tariffs and taxes being put on them, it is actually cheaper for clothes or products to be made in Mexico or Canada than in the United States, because it costs them nothing to bring those products back into the United States. Another area in which benefited from this act was the automobile industry. Most of your Fords, um, uh, cruisers and trucks and things like that are built, SUVs are built in Mexico. Ford tractors and equipment is built in Canada. Very little is actually made in the United States. And what is made in the United States is generally just assembled in the United States. The products, the actual pieces, are made in other countries, not in the United States. So a lot of the automobile industry moved to Canada or Mexico. Same thing with Chevrolet did the same thing. A lot of their factories moved to Mexico or Canada, which you may have a car that says made in America, but chances are it was assembled in America, not made in America. That means the fenders, the doors, and things like that were made somewhere else. So something to think about. Okay. I will say that Donald Trump has done away with the North American Free Trade Act. He got rid of it and has renegotiated what he considers to be a better deal with North America, with Canada and Mexico. Now the question is that actually going to work? Is it a better deal? Well, it's a little early to tell. We need a couple years to see if the new deal is actually a better deal. We won't know for many years. Once again, we didn't realize that North American Free Trade Act, NAFTA, was going to be so devastating to our economy here in America. However, it was, and especially for our area of America. It may have been beneficial for other places in America, but it did not benefit this area of the United States. It was a horrible deal for us here in this area, especially in the Madison, Mayadan, Eden area. Eden was a prosperous city in the 1990s until this act came about, and then basically all those factories that are empty in Eden, well, they are empty because of NAFTA. So there you are, something to think about. The International Monetary Fund, the IMF. It's 189 countries strong. It fosters global monetary cooperation. Basically, it ensures fair trade and promotes high employment and wants to end poverty around the world. The idea here is to keep prices of products at a certain level in order to improve the standard of living from the countries. So yes, they could sell that t-shirt at $5 a shirt, but maybe if they sold it at $7, then the employees that worked in the factory could have, a improved life, because the companies could then afford to pay them more money. And sometimes that is part of the negotiation to improve the lives of the people who are making the products in these third world countries. All right. Globalization. Final statement. Why do we need globalization? Well, we want to make sure that we are getting the best products for the best buck. We want to see ourselves being able to buy things we've always wanted to buy. Countries around the world have things that are unique to offer us in the United States. Also, if we buy their goods, they are more likely to buy our goods. Negotiating these trade deals is super important, and it's something that we should continue to pursue. However, if a deal causes harm in the United States, we do need to renegotiate those trade deals. So globalization has a bad side. You can see through globalization, jobs in America shift. We used to make a lot of products here. Now we have to think about reinventing ourselves. That's the next great thing for America. The reinvention process. You have an opportunity in the future to come up with some new product that countries around the world can't take away from us. America has a reputation of making the finest products in the world. If you want something made well and better than Asian market or even European market, then you buy something made in America. The problem with this is you get what you pay for. So, generally speaking, you can buy furniture made in America, but the cost of that furniture is going to be extremely high. Or you can go onto Amazon and buy something made in China or someplace like that at much less. The question here is you have to ask yourself, do you want quality or quantity? If we continue as the road that we are on, our economy is going to continue to suffer. The question here is can you, as a future entrepreneur, a person who starts their own business, can you come up with a product that is unique, that is valuable, and well made, that other people would be willing to spend the extra money to have made by you here in America versus a similar product made cheaper elsewhere? Today, if I was going to school with my own personal interests and things, I would probably go to Luthering School and be a crafts, handmade instrument maker. Why? Because what's being mass produced around the world is good quality, but it's not great quality. I believe that things should be done right and done right the first time. And I believe that Americans have the ability to be inventive, and I believe we have the ability to make things that are at a higher quality than what other countries can offer. And that is the question for you in the future. Are you going to find a job or make a product that is going to be better than the products available elsewhere? If you do, and if you can, then you're going to be able to offer jobs to Americans that cannot be taken by China or by Mexico or Canada or elsewhere. If you have jobs, a lot of jobs in America today that are being created are intellectual jobs. It is because of our higher level of education, our higher level of college education, that is allowing for us to be leaders intellectually and to find a way to sell our intellect by the creation of new stuff. The products may be actually made in another country, but the design was made in America. Newsflash, if you own an Apple product, all of Apple products, your cell phone, your iPad, your MacBook, your iWatch, whatever, all of those things are made in China, but they weren't designed there. The creations and the creative intellect that was necessary to create all those products were made here in the United States and California by developers and engineers who came up with those products. This is the future of America. The question is, at what point are you going to be a part of it? And are you going to step up to the challenge of literally making America great again? It's your chance. It's your opportunity. Now that you understand how we affect the world and how the world affects us, I hope that you guys rise to the challenge. This is the last lecture for this series. The course is completed. I hope that you have learned something this year. I wish that it had been in person and that we could have learned more in-depthly, more about the economy and other things, but because of COVID-19, this distance learning is a experience in which was unforeseeable. But I wish you all the very, very best, and I hope that you gain some knowledge from what you have learned in this class this year. If you have turned in all your work and you take today's quiz and are finished with it, then you are done with my class. If you owe me work still, you have 1 week to get it in. For those of you who are finished, I hope that you have a wonderful summer, and I hope to see you again next year, or see you very soon. Good luck, and I will see you guys in the fall. For those of you who owe me work, get busy. You've got 1 week to get it in. I expect to have all work turned in by noon on Friday, the 29th. So get the work in so that I can get your grades done. Y'all have a blessed summer and a blessed day. I will talk to you guys later. Bye.